problem that the Russians face is they can't trust the West, they can't trust Ukraine, and they have to plan for a rainy day. They have to plan for the possibility that Ukraine and the West will come back after them in a couple of years, should you get a frozen conflict. And should that be the case, if you're the Russians, you want to control as much territory as possible. So there are very powerful strategic incentives for the Russians to take more territory. Zelensky has made the point very clearly. There's only one country on the planet that can give Ukraine meaningful security guarantees, and that country is the United States of America. And we have made it clear we're not going to give them a security guarantee. And the idea that the French and the British are, and that they're going to take up the slack as we begin to slither away from Europe, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that.
Right. Yeah. It's not a good place to invest your cash if you're looking to get a good investment return. You mentioned earlier in this show that really what's on the table right now is a recognition of reality and only losing the 4 oblasts that have already been annexed by the Russian Federation into their territory. Crimea, of course, will stay on the Russian side. Or you can ignore reality and keep going. There is some news out of the Institute for the Study of War earlier today that gives plausibility to that and actually quantifies it a little bit based on some comments coming out of Russia. Thanks, Gary. This was today in the Institute for the Study of War, published this morning about yesterday's update. It says the Kremlin continues to demand that Ukraine cede Ukrainian territory that Russia does not currently occupy and set conditions to make further territorial demands. Russian business outlet Kommersant reported on March 18th that its sources that Russian President Vladimir Putin stated at a private meeting that Russia would not claim Odessa and other territories if unspecified countries recognized the administrative borders of those 4 territories. So President Putin allowed to be leaked that basically he just agreed with what you said. If we agree right now, that's where the territorial losses stop. But Putin also recently claimed that Novorossiya, which one of our guests mentioned a minute ago, is an integral part of Russia. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Novorossiya is all of eastern and southern Ukraine, including the Odessa Oblast. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky stated on March 18th, that Russian forces are concentrating in Kursk Oblast and on the border with Sumy Oblast and may be preparing for new attacks on Sumy, Kharkiv, and in the southern part of the Zaporozhye Oblast. So militarily, there's a lot of things going on there. You see there's the Kherson down there in the lower part, Kharkiv in the upper part, and Sumy kind of in the center of the top. There are Russian large-scale formations that appear to be poised where they could actually launch into Ukraine and to take even more territory. And one wonders if this is a signal from Moscow that we can either do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way. But one of these two things is going to come about. How do you see that?
I agree. I think we, and especially the Ukrainians, have a deep-seated interest in getting an agreement in place now and making sure that the Russians don't physically control oblasts like Odessa and Kharkiv. I mean, it's just in Ukraine's interest. And the idea that they're going to be able to prevent that from happening and, in fact, roll back the Russian gains of the past few years is delusional. It's not going to happen. If anything, the Russians are on the march. Yes, they're moving slowly, but it is a steamroller, and they're likely to pick up speed moving forward. It's imperative from Ukraine's point of view, in my humble opinion, to stop this now and to cut a deal, given the 4 oblasts and Crimea are lost, but nothing else is lost. If you go on here, you're going to lose more territory. Once the Russians capture territory, it's going to be very difficult to dislodge them. And the reason is that there are powerful incentives for the Russians to keep more territory than they now have, because they have to plan for a rainy day. They have to worry about the possibility, right, that Ukraine and the West will come back after them. And in that situation, you want to control as much of the eastern half of Ukraine as you possibly can. And by the way, taking Odessa basically means that Ukraine, the rump state, the surviving dysfunctional rump state, will have no access to the Black Sea. And that will mean that that dysfunctional rump state is especially dysfunctional. And from Ukraine's point of view, you don't want to let that happen. You want to keep Odessa. You want to have access to the Black Sea. So cut a deal now. But again, you and I have been arguing this for a long, long time, and we don't even get out of the batter's box, much less to first base, making this argument.
Right. There will come a day, though, when people in the West wished we had gotten out of the batter's box, because it'll be too late to undo the damage then. One of the other things that's keeping ideas like yours in mind, maybe even in the dugout, maybe not even so much at the plate, is the other portion of this. We talked about the Russian side, the U.S. side, and the European side. Well, there's also the Ukrainian side. And after Trump has said that he wants 1 to 30-day ceasefire, total ceasefire, and then at least got sort of the agreement on a limited air ceasefire in terms of hitting energy infrastructure. There's some question about whether either side has abided by that since that agreement was made. But then you had this from Zelensky earlier today, where he seems to imply actually nothing's been agreed to yet.
Тут я сказав президенту Трампу, що цивільна інфраструктура дуже всеосяжне таке поняття, і ми домовилися, що ми з нашого боку зробимо все, щоб підготувати список об'єктів, які ми вважаємо там пріоритетними, і що ми вважаємо цивільною інфраструктурою. Ми підготуємо, і тут може бути і також різна інфраструктура, і інфраструктурні речі, як залізниця, а також ми будемо говорити про портову інфраструктуру. Я не знаю, що підтвердять партнери, але ми підготуємось до цієї зустрічі в Саудівській Аравії.
Now, overnight, the Ukraine side had a very successful drone strike on Ingalls Air Force Base in the Saratov Oblast. I think it was about 700 kilometers away from the front line, where a lot of Russian aircraft take off from, where they drop these glide bombs and several other things. And so it sounds like Ukraine doesn't want to give up the ability to do that, to hit that. Now, that wasn't part of, that's some of them right there. It was apparently quite a sizable hit of some sort. So they don't want to get that. But you see that Zelensky's saying, well, maybe it'll include this, maybe it won't include that, but we'll talk about that in Saudi Arabia in the next meeting. So that seems to kind of drag it out too, because he seems maybe even more than the Europeans not to want to let this go. And I would ask the question, is he just delusional and so totally disconnected from reality that he somehow thinks dragging this out will work out well? But I guess it really kind of answers its own question. How do you see it?
Well, there are two issues here. In terms of just dragging the war out, not reaching some sort of agreement now, he is delusional, as we have discussed. But with regard to this ceasefire, I think that this is what's going on, Danny. When Trump talked to Putin, what was on the table from Trump's perspective, as I understand it, was a general ceasefire. You remember that both the Ukrainians and the Trump administration had agreed to a ceasefire, a general ceasefire. And that's what Trump proposed to Putin. Putin said he wasn't interested in a general ceasefire. What he wanted was a ceasefire that involved attacks on infrastructure. Now, a lot of people believe that Putin put that forward because the Ukrainians at this point in time have an upper hand when it comes to attacking infrastructure. The Russians have pretty much destroyed all the infrastructure they can, and there are a lot of fat targets in Russia that the Ukrainians are getting pretty good at hitting. So it's not in Ukraine's interest in this story to agree to a ceasefire that involves just infrastructure. So that's why you see Zelensky has little interest in this ceasefire proposal that Putin put forward and that Trump accepted. And this is why he's juking and jiving and continuing to attack infrastructure as much as he can and delaying a final decision on when there's going to be a ceasefire involving infrastructure.
Now, some of the Russian experts I've been conferring with here of late suggest that their expectations of the Russian side will be that they're not going to be in any hurry for anything. They're just going to continue going on with these slow and methodical but lethal strikes that they've been doing, the advancing on the ground. Putin said a couple of days ago that he wants Gerasimov, their general, to carve out a security buffer on the north in the Sumy area, which seems to line up with what Zelensky says he sees forming on the northern part of his border. And of course, all in the western part, or the eastern front, where they're going to the west. So the question is, do you see Russia just saying, I'm content to let you guys drag this out because I'm just going to keep on going until I get what I want? Or might his patience come to an end, and might they actually launch a large-scale offensive, which they really haven't done since 2022?
Again, Danny, I think you're focusing too much on the ceasefire, which is not meaningful. The Russians are not interested in a meaningful ceasefire. The Russians are interested in a meaningful peace agreement. And until the West and Ukraine are prepared to accept Russia's key terms and move towards a peace agreement, a genuine peace agreement, there's going to be no meaningful ceasefire. So there's no meaningful ceasefire on the table.
Now, actually, in that report, there was, I guess it was before Trump and the U.S. and the Ukraine side agreed to seek a 30-day full-on ceasefire. We had shown here where Sergei Lavrov, maybe 2 weeks before that, just categorically said there won't be any ceasefire. We're just going to we want really what you just said there. We want a complete and total end of war decision, and then we'll stop fighting, but not until that time. So now Putin has gone back and said, well, I'll consider it. But do you think that that's just gamesmanship and that that original statement is still where they are?
What Lavrov said is the Russian position to include Putin. They have said this over and over. What Putin is doing is he's showing his diplomatic skills. He doesn't want to antagonize Donald Trump, who put forward the idea of the ceasefire. It was Trump's idea. He introduced this in the telephone conversation the other day. And Putin didn't want to say no ceasefire. It's not going to happen until we get meaningful agreement on genuine peace terms. Putin didn't want to do that. He wanted to throw a bone to Trump. And he did throw him a bone where he said, let's have a ceasefire that involves attacks on infrastructure. And as I said, a lot of people believe, I'm not 100% sure where the bottom line is here, but a lot of people believe that a ceasefire involving just infrastructure would be to Russia's advantage. And I think Zelensky thinks that. But there's not going to be a meaningful ceasefire. This is what we talk about in the media because we need something to talk about. We have this whole discourse that goes on and on and on about ceasefire this and ceasefire that. It doesn't matter. The question is, are we going to get a meaningful peace agreement? And whether or not we get a meaningful peace agreement depends on whether or not we accept the three main arguments or demands that the Russians have put on the table. It's as simple as that. And by the way, I would imagine that Putin and Trump talked about those demands. They're just not telling us what they said. And if they didn't talk about it, I bet their lieutenants who are meeting behind the scenes are talking about it, because there's no point in talking about negotiating a peace agreement with the Russians and improving relations if you don't deal with those three demands.